Welcome to the Reunion Podcast, a fictional, imaginative story about an aging Beatles fan. This is the 5th episode, which is called The Commandments. Again, I have to give you a little disclaimer that this is a work of fiction. Any names or characters, businesses or places, events or incidents are fictitious. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. In the previous episode, Widlowski spared no effort to persuade his friends for a reunion concert, and succeeded to rekindle a little bit of romance with Beata. For a moment, it felt great to gather in a restaurant and sing a song together again. It was far later in the evening as the jail cell doors slid shut, clicking loudly, with finality. Widlowski stared at the bars that now separated him and his friends from freedom. Jean slowly walked over to the bench against the back wall, while Adam scratched the back of his head, as if trying to figure out what in the hell he could have done to have landed him in this situation. Jana slid her arm around Ladislav, guiding him to one of the other benches, leaving Widlowski and Beata standing for a few more tense, silent moments. Then they, too, walked to a bench and sat down.
It doesn't make sense. Who called the cops? People were having fun, weren't they?
Oh, just give it a rest.
Give a rest. A rest. Ha ha. But it was nice for a moment there. All of us singing. Didn't you feel something? I'm sure the concert...
The concert? There isn't going to be a concert.
Got it. You're upset, but we can...
There's no we either. These past few days... It was a mistake, a fantasy. I'm sorry.
You've got nothing to apologize for.
Yes, I do. I saw you and something felt rekindled, and it got out of hand. I led you on, myself too, with these silly little trysts.
It's not silly. You keep talking about this life that's real, this life you need to go back to. Nothing's been real for me since you.
The silence between them was heavy. He wished he could feel Drug's comforting presence here at that moment. A warm hand of support. A voice of reason, or to cheer him on. At this moment, Widlowski was on his own. He wondered if he'd been on the entire time, if Drug had really been there at all, encouraging him, supporting him, pointing out what he needed to see, what he needed to hear.
I'm sorry, but this woman you've spent years pining for, this saint, she's gone. She doesn't exist.
Widlowski wanted to believe that everything would work out, that it still could. He couldn't stop himself from reaching and touching her shoulder, for needing to feel a connection between them that wasn't imagined.
Feels real to me.
She looked at him, long and hard, as if deciding to say something but not quite finding the words to do so.
She's yours.
Who's she? Who's mine? Are you mine?
I lied before. My daughter. Our daughter. I was pregnant before you left. Haritonov and I raised her, but you are her father.
I don't...
It's all right. It doesn't matter anymore. None of it does.
You're free to go.
Beata and dazed Widlowski stepped toward the door. The officer put his hand out, blocking Widlowski.
She is. You'll be processed in a few hours.
Haritonov walked in behind the officer and approached Beata, carrying her coat. He glanced towards the cell, seeing them all, but only nodding towards Jean. It was a surprisingly friendly gesture that had Widlowski's head snapping back to look at Jean, who looked away, mildly embarrassed. The others all looked at Jean as well, surprise coloring their faces. Adam leveled a stare of pure outrage at Jean. Widlowski reached past the officer, grabbing Beata's wrist, even though he had to step over the line. The officer grabbed Widlowski, only to release when Haritonov held a hand up. Widlowski could see the amusement in Haritonov's face when Beata turned towards Widlowski. But he didn't care. Haritonov didn't matter. Beata had been right and wrong.
I'll save you from your real jail, where he's taking you to keep away from freedom. I'm not going to give up. I won't abandon you.
But you already did.
Her words stung him and paralyzed him in place, but he kept holding her wrist until she pulled her hand free. Haritonov draped her coat around her shoulders and leveled a look at the officer, who was ushering Widlowski backward into the cell. Beata walked around the corner and out into the hallway with Haritonov trailing behind her. Haritonov stopped abruptly, though, and walked back, pointing at Widlowski as a victorious smile spread across his lips.
You should probably check that one's visa against database. If I'm not mistaken, he's about to overstay his welcome.
Haritonov turned and went out, waving sardonically over his shoulder on the way, before he murmured sweet nothings to Beata. Widlowski lowered his head and walked over to the bench furthest from his friends, and laid down, sighing in defeat. A heavy silence hung around the room. Widlowski saw Jean pull out a cell phone from a deep pocket inside his jacket, just before he turned away from the friends facing a dirty wall.
Advantage to have 3 cell phones. Turned in a couple to the guards, still could sneak one in.
Now I begin to understand why we call them cell phones. If you get my drift, pun intended.
Here's some music for the occasion.
Bob Dylan's voice was low and quiet, but spread out to reach even Widlowski. Not Dark Yet flowed from Jean's cell phone at Widlowski's side, glad to have at least something to keep himself from going stir-crazy in here. Widlowski turned to lay on his back on the bench and closed his eyes, and the jail cell had faded away into Beatles' hell. Even the bench felt jagged beneath his back as if stone spikes now pressed into his body. Widlowski winced as a frightening pair of faces appeared over him. Harihara glowered down at Widlowski, victory gleaming in those 4 eyes. The demon whisked himself back across the hellscape jail cell, beyond the stone and jagged bars that stood in front of Widlowski.